After Sean Connery returned for Diamonds Are Forever and the dust settled on that outing, attention turned to the next Bond outing, Live and Let Die. Connery declined the offer to appear in another Bond movie, and so the search was on yet again for a replacement, ideally one which would last more than one film. Several actors were considered for the role. Michael Billington and John Gavin were amongst the names that the producers were thinking about. John Gavin actually came very close to getting the role, but as we all know, there was another actor the producers preferred. Roger Moore was cast as the new James Bond. Moore was best known for playing Simon Templar in The Saint from 1962 to 1969. Roger Moore had been in the producers' frame of mind as far back as Dr. No. Roger Moore's first Bond film, Live and Let Die, was released on the 27th of June 1973. It was directed by Guy Hamilton, who returned once again. Live and Let Die's cinematography was done by Ted Moore, who had previously worked on most of the Connery films. Ted Moore won a BAFTA for Best Cinematography for From Russia with Love. Ted Moore's long association with the series helps give the film a consistent look to, and of course, it is very well shot. Live and Let Die, alongside the voodoo themes, has a very unique look and aesthetic to it compared to the other Bond outings. But this was the first Bond film not to feature Q. Apparently, Albert Broccoli and Harry Saltzman wanted to lessen the series' dependency on gadgets, so they decided to rest the character. Desmond Llewellyn understandably wasn't very happy about this. Q returned in the next Bond film and wouldn't miss a Bond film again until 2006. Felix Leiter appears once again, but as is par for the course at this stage, is also recast. Getting somebody to play Leiter for more than one film was clearly an impossibility at this point. David Hedison, a friend of Roger Moore's, was the new Felix Leiter. David Hedison is pretty great as Leiter. His chemistry with Moore is pretty good. This is helped by the fact that Hedison was nearly the same age as Moore, only a few months difference, and of course they knew each other outside of Bond. Hedison gets a good amount of screen time, though a few more scenes with Moore would have been great, but that's only a minor complaint. Very minor. Live and Let Die was the only Roger Moore Bond outing to feature Felix Leiter, marking the end of the better part of a decade of regular appearances. Felix Leiter wouldn't appear again until 1987's The Living Daylights. Yaphet Kotto is great as Dr. Kananga / Mr. Big. Dr. Kananga is very different from the villains that we come to expect so far in the series, and this makes him all the more interesting. He's not a megalomaniacal Spectre agent, he's a drug lord. Certain aspects of Live and Die haven't aged well, but Yaphet Kotto's performance is still pretty great, almost 47 years later. At time of recording. Jane Seymour as Solitaire makes for a pretty good Bond girl. Solitaire, unlike a few Bond girls, is actually relevant to the plot. I wouldn't quite call Solitaire a three-dimensional character, but she's certainly better written than quite a few Bond girls at this point in the series. Live and Let Die is a very good film. It's well paced, the humour works very well, especially with Clifton James as Sheriff J.W. Pepper. Guy Hamilton continues to be a fantastic director of the Bond series, and of course Roger Moore is brilliant in his debut as James Bond. Roger Moore is the best thing about this movie. He doesn't put a foot wrong with his performance. Moore is clearly having a blast playing 007. His wit and charm is on top form. This isn't even Moore's best performance as Bond, but it's certainly a very good start. The Man with the Golden Gun was directed by Guy Hamilton, who returned for his final Bond film. The Man with the Golden Gun was released little over a year after Live and Let Die. The Man with the Golden Gun was released on the 19th of December 1974. It was the last time that the gap between James Bond films was just a year. Was The Man with the Golden Gun rushed into production after the success of Live and Let Die? You decide. The Man with the Golden Gun is probably the weakest Bond movie at this stage of the franchise. A lot of the humour falls flat, to be honest. This movie would have worked a lot better if it cut out a lot of the comedic elements and took itself more seriously. Kung Fu was also very popular around the time, and part of the movie consists of Bond forced to compete at a karate school, and this drags the film down so much. It adds very little to the story, and the humour doesn't work, so there's not even that element to praise. Roger Moore is great once again as Bond, but how Bond is written is a bit poor. Bond comes across as a bit of an insensitive arse in this film, particularly when it comes to Maud Adams' character, Andrea. It feels like this film would have been better suited with Connery in it. Moore's still great, but the writing is weaker, and Moore isn't as suited to this way of writing Bond. Britt Eklund as Mary Goodnight is possibly one of the most incompetent Bond girls ever. On many occasions, Mary makes Bond's mission harder for him, and rarely makes it easier by clearing away some sort of obstacle. Eklund is great, but once again the issues lie with the writing. Christopher Lee as Francisco Scaramanga is fantastic. He's the best part about this movie. His performances are magnetic, and the on-screen dynamic between Lee and Moore is brilliant. Scaramanga is such a charismatic, gentlemanly figure, and this makes him more interesting to watch than your average Bond villain. Hervé Villachet is great as Knick-Knack. He's fantastic on screen and one of the more interesting Bond henchmen so far in the series. The production of The Man with the Golden Gun was famously turbulent. The partnership of Albert Broccoli and Harry Saltzman dissolved with this film after Saltzman sold his stake in Danjaq to Broccoli. A lot of the script was rewritten while filming was still taking place. This perhaps explains why the humour feels a bit clunky, and certain aspects of the film could have been cut out entirely. The Man with a Gun didn't receive glowing reviews, and the financial side of things weren't great either. The film was one of the lowest grossing Bond outings. It made $97.6 million. Live and Let Die from the previous year made $161.8 million. The future of the franchise was now looking uncertain. People were wondering if James Bond, a product of the 50s and 60s, was now out of date. Well, the next film not only had to be great on its own merits, but also arguably save the franchise. The Spy Who Loved Me was released on the 7th of July 1977, almost 3 years after the previous film. Lewis Gilbert, who directed Live and Let Die 10 years prior, returned to direct. The cinematography was done by Claude Renoir, a French cinematographer whose back catalogue of films is very unknown to me, so I have very little to say about his previous work. The Spy Who Loved Me is regarded as one of the strongest outings in the Bond series, proof that a light-hearted installment can be just as popular as a more serious outing such as Casino Royale. From the very beginning, the pre-title sequence demonstrates a newfound confidence that the series has not had since perhaps Goldfinger or On Her Majesty's Secret Service. The opening is well paced, the humour works, and it makes for an enjoyable start to the movie. Roger Moore is fantastic as James Bond and gives his best performance as Bond. At this stage, he's totally comfortable being 007. There's not a single scene that feels out of place. It's his third film, and Moore gives off a very confident and purely Bondian performance. The script also helps, and Bond is written far better this time round than in the previous entry. Richard Kiel is brilliant as Jaws, one of the best henchmen in the entire series. However, Jaws is very much a more tongue-in-cheek henchman, but can also be intimidating effectively. Jaws has no lines, but Keel is still able to bring a great performance. This is obviously all done to the body language and things like that. Barbara Bach as Anya Amasov makes for one of the best Bond girls. It works that she's a Russian agent, as it means that she's not dependent on Bond. Barbara Bach is also rather good in the role and can actually act, unlike some previous Bond girls. The on-screen dynamics between Bach and Moore also works really well, and it makes the movie all the more engaging. Kurt Jürgens as Karl Stromberg is pretty good, although Stromberg as a character may actually be one of the weaker elements. Jürgens is great, his lighting delivery is fantastic, but Stromberg doesn't get enough screen time, and his final encounter with Bond is a bit anticlimactic. It's a bit of a shame, as the final act is brilliant, but it does let the side down a bit. Speaking of the final act, it's utterly superb. Lewis Gilbert and Claude Renoir knocked it out of the park. It's fantastically shot, and the lighting is very nicely done. It's suspenseful when it needs to be, and funny when it needs to be. It just works incredibly well. Lewis Gilbert did a pretty good job directing You Only Live Twice, but in my opinion, he had come a long way in the intervening 10 years, and this film is a marked visual improvement, and might be one of the best looking Bond films. Roger Moore is great during the whole film, but is of particular brilliance during the final act, and Bond's final clash in this film with Jaws is brilliant. Once again, the tension and the humour is expertly balanced. So The Spy Who Loved Me is an incredibly fun movie. The title song is great, Roger Moore is on top form, and everything is pretty much firing on all cylinders. The humour works very well. It's not a constant, and it doesn't become irritating. It helps keep the film jovial and light, but the seriousness and tension comes in and works when it is needed. The Spy Who Loved Me is one of the best Bond films, and with good reason. It was a much bigger success than many of the previous outings. It grossed $185.4 million from a $13.5 million budget, a huge improvement over the previous film. The future of the franchise was secured, and the next film would see the producers take inspiration from another 1977 classic, Star Wars. Moonraker was released on June 26, 1979, and Lewis Gilbert directed what was his final Bond film. Moonraker divides opinion like no other Bond movie, and I don't really know why this is. I don't really know why this is the movie that many people consider to be the worst Bond movie. Of all the possible worst ones, why this one? As you can probably tell, I liked Moonraker. The pre-title sequence isn't actually too dissimilar to the one from The Spy Who Loved Me. It follows many similar patterns, but that doesn't make it a bad thing. It's still a thoroughly entertaining way to kick off the film. The pre-title sequence also features the return of Jaws, who appears throughout the film. The Moonraker title song was sung by Shirley Bassey, who returned for the third and final time for a Bond song. To be honest, the song is well sung and everything, but it is a tad underwhelming, especially compared to Goldfinger and Diamonds Are Forever. Michael Lonsdale is fantastic as Hugo Drax. Drax is one of the softer spoken villains, but when pushed, he will snap. Lonsdale's performance is brilliant. There isn't really much more to be said. Roger Moore is once again on fine form as James Bond, this being his fourth film in the role. Moore has settled in the role but hasn't become bored with it. The charm and wit is still there, so even if you hate the story, you'll at least enjoy watching Roger Moore. Richard Kiel as Jaws is brilliant. Jaws continues to be a physically dominant presence on screen, and this, coupled with the effective humour, makes Jaws a thoroughly entertaining character. This was the final Bond film to feature Jaws, which is a bit of a shame, as another Jaws appearance wouldn't have gone amiss. This was the final Bond film to feature Bernard Lee as M. Bernard Lee passed away away before his scenes for For Your Eyes Only, the next Bond film, could be shot. For many people, Bernard Lee is the best M in the series. Lee had a good on-screen dynamic with Connery, Lazenby and Moore. Lee always brought a great deal of warmth to the character, but also a sharpness when required. Casting Bernard Lee in Dr. No over 17 years prior was a fantastic decision which paid off hugely. Throughout the changes in the series, the Bond actors, the directors, the writers, Bernard Lee was in every film, even if he only appeared in a few scenes sometimes. Bernard Lee gets a good degree of screen time in Moonraker, and he's just as great in this one as he was in all the previous outings. The final act is pretty great, with Bond and Holly Goodhead in space. The space sequences are well shot, and the cast are all in fine form. I don't really mind Bond going into space because it's already been fairly suggested in the film at this point. It also suits the more comedic tone of this era. If Daniel Craig were to go into space during one of his gritty Bond films, then a degree of outrage would be understandable. This era Bond was famously over the top, but it's not like a carry-on film, you just have to go along with it. Moonraker isn't as good as A Spy Love Me, but it's still a very confidently made movie. The performances are great, and the humour and direction continues to work well. This was possibly the Bond series at its most over the top. The film did do very well at the box office, however. It made $210.3 million from a $34 million budget. The Bond series was continuing to grip audiences nearly 20 years since Dr. No. The next film would take the series down to earth and into more serious territory. For Your Eyes Only was directed by John Glenn, who worked on several Bond films. He was the editor on Moonraker, The Spy Love Me, and on Her Majesty's Secret Service. Along with editing these films, he was also the second unit director, so John Glenn was already very familiar with the world of James Bond before he directed For Your Eyes Only. For Your Eyes Only takes the Bond franchise in a much more serious and grounded direction. There are fewer gadgets and one-liners, and while it isn't as dark and gritty as License to Kill or Casino Royale, it is certainly the most grounded and serious Roger Moore Bond film. M is written as being on leave. M was not recast immediately due to the passing of Bernard Lee. Instead, the role of M is filled by Bill Tanner, as played by James Villiers. Jeffrey Keane also returns as Sir Frederick Grey, the Minister of Defence, and he too fills in a lot of the expositional dialogue that M would have said. James Villiers does a decent job as Bill Tanner, but there isn't much in the way of personality or warmth. Tanner doesn't seem like a great substitute for M, but the Minister, as played by Jeffrey Keane, continues to be great on screen. Roger Moore is once again fantastic in his fifth Bond outing. His performance is different here, due to the more serious tone. There are fewer one-liners and puns. Moore proves himself capable of working well with a more grounded script. This may be the most underrated Moore performance in the Bond series. John Glenn does a superb job in his first Bond film and his directorial debut. The action and fight sequences are brilliantly shot. This is probably the first Bond film in a long time to have moments of genuine suspense and tension. Glenn proves himself to be a very capable director here. There's nothing about this film that suggests he was in any way inexperienced. At times, the musical score does feel a bit out of place, particularly during action sequences. It feels a bit tensionless. This isn't true for every action sequence, but a few have a very jarring musical score that feels just a bit off. Julian Glover makes for a fantastic villain in Aristotle Christatos. He's one of the more underrated villains, but I think he's great. For Your Eyes Only is a great film. It's not perfect, but the positives far outweigh the negatives. The more serious tone is very refreshing, particularly in the context of the Roger Moore era. For Your Eyes Only also proved that there was still an appetite for Bond adventures. It grossed $195.3 million from a budget of $28 million, a slight drop from Moonraker, but still a huge success. Many people regard For Your Eyes Only as the film where Roger Moore should have bowed out as Bond, but is that fair on his final two Bond outings? Octopussy was released on the 6th of June 1983, 2 years after For Your Eyes Only. John Glenn returned to direct once again. A much lighter tone returned for this outing, although things weren't quite as over the top as they were with Moonraker. Roger Moore is once again on fine form in his penultimate outing as James Bond. He's not quite as convincing as he once was during the action sequences, although his era of Bond has never been particularly reliant on action. Moore's line delivery is top notch here. Interestingly, there was the possibility of recasting Moore, as his contract was now only on a film-by-film basis. But due to the unofficial Never Say Never Again being released later in 1983, the producers ditched the idea of recasting Bond, as they thought a Bond film with Moore would do well in the box office against Never Say Never Again, starring Sean Connery. Louis Jourdan is excellent as Kamal Khan. He makes for a great villain, more in terms of the performance rather than how the character is written, but Khan is great on screen. Kabir Bedi as Gobinder makes for a brilliant henchman, perhaps on par with the likes of Oddjob and Jules. The villain-henchman dynamic is possibly at its best since the Connery era. Gobinder is an utterly relentless henchman and is one of the best bits of the movie. Stephen Burkoff is pretty great as General Orlov. It's a shame that he didn't get more screen time, but he's still great. It's nice that Desmond Llewellyn gets plenty of screen time in Octopussy. He works well on screen with Roger Moore, and it's somewhat refreshing at this stage in the series to see Q involved in Bond's mission. In Octopussy, the role of M was recast, and Robert Brown was cast in the role. Robert Brown previously appeared in The Spy Who Loved Me as Admiral Hargreaves. It's never stated if he's intended to be the same character, but in my mind he is, and it's never contradicted. Robert Brown does a pretty good job as M in the few scenes he's in. Replacing Burnley was always going to be hard for whoever took over, and Robert Brown fills in the role very nicely. Octopussy grossed $187.5 million from a budget of $27.5 million, a sign that audiences were weren't quite done with Roger Moore as James Bond quite yet. Although the numbers were down on the last few outings, it made slightly more than The Spy Who Loved Me. Octopussy is on the whole a fun movie and a great way to kill a couple of hours. It's not especially groundbreaking, and it does feel like the franchise is running out of steam at this point. Octopussy is fairly average and on the lower end of the Moore films in terms of quality, but it still makes for an enjoyable couple of hours. The cast are all brilliant, the cinematography is done by DOP Alan Hume is very well done, the humour works effectively, but in many senses it feels like we've all seen this before and things do seem a bit played out. A View to a Kill, Roger Moore's seventh and final Bond film, was released on the 13th of June 1985, and John Glenn directed his third consecutive Bond film. A View to a Kill is certainly one of the sillier Bond films, and while it's not without its darker moments, it's still a very light-hearted Bond movie, which is very much in keeping with the rest of the Roger Moore era. Roger Moore is once again great as James Bond, although he's never been less convincing as a cold-blooded killer than he is here. It's great to see more of Robert Brown as M, who continues to be pretty great in the role. His performance isn't greatly changed from his performance in Octopussy, but it's great that M gets a bit more screen time in this film. Christopher Walken as Max Zorin makes for a great villain, and a surprisingly threatening and persistent one. The way in which Zorin is defeated is a tad underwhelming, but Walken himself is great throughout. Grace Jones as Mayday makes for a rather great henchwoman, and a lot of the fight sequences are pretty entertaining. May not have been so great if Grace Jones wasn't playing Mayday. A View to a Kill is certainly an entertaining movie, but everything feels quite played out. A lot of the principal MI6 regulars were in their 50s or 60s, and feels like the franchise was in desperate need of a new era. It grossed $152.4 million from a budget of $30 million, a sign that perhaps audiences were starting to become disinterested. A View to a Kill was not only Roger Moore's final Bond film, but also Lois Maxwell's final Bond outing as Miss Moneypenny. Lois Maxwell had appeared in every Bond film in the Eon series since Dr. No. Moneypenny's involvement in the series had somewhat shrunk, but at this stage in the series, with the character relegated to 1 or 2 scenes per film. Lois Maxwell doesn't really get much of a send-off in A View to a Kill, with her final scene being a footnote in the Bond filmography. Lois Maxwell was great in every Bond film she appeared in, although Moneypenny getting recast for the next film seems right. As I've said, the franchise was in need of a refresher, but Lois Maxwell remains many people's favourite version of Miss Moneypenny, and for good reason. So that concludes the Roger Moore era. It spans 7 films made across 12 years. It certainly did deviate from the original Fleming novels, but for what they are entertaining films that happily kill a couple of hours. Roger Moore is great in all of his Bond films. His enthusiasm for the role was never ending. The films very much suited the time in which they were made. They would have been totally out of place in any other era. But after 12 years of Roger Moore, it was time for a fresh new era to take shape.